Hey there, Mama. You're listening to the Lift the Shame podcast. I'm your host, Crystal, mama of 5 and your family's intuitive eating dietitian, here to help you cut through the diet culture clutter so you can enjoy freedom with food as a family. I'm on a mission to help you end the generational legacy of diet culture in your home so you can experience motherhood free from food guilt and body shame. Listen in weekly for guidance on how you can ditch diet culture, heal your relationship with food and your body, and confidently raise intuitive eaters. Let's dive in and lift the shame together. Hey Mama, welcome back to the show. I so appreciate you tuning in and I'm so glad that you're here today. And lately, over the last few weeks, I've received several of your questions specifically around kids and sweets. And if you've been tuning into this podcast, you know this is a topic I love to chat about, mainly because there's so much misinformation and sweets are highly demonized in our culture, especially by diet culture. And when we're talking about raising kids to have a healthy and positive relationship with food, sweets really need to be part of that equation. And this can be so foreign for so many of us because a lot of us grew up under this mentality that sweets are bad, sweets are toxic, sweets are addictive, and therefore we shouldn't be trusted to eat them. And unfortunately, this can result in a very tumultuous relationship with sweets and a resulting internalized belief that we can't trust our bodies. And the reality is that we can trust our bodies with the variety of foods. And I know if you're tuning in and healing your relationship with food, you want to shift that culture and that narrative around sweets in your home. And so we are going to dive in and answer your questions today so that you can feel more confident as you navigate all these various different scenarios. And I just want to say too that I love your questions and I appreciate the time that you take to reach out and share your thoughts with me. And so please continue to send any thoughts or questions my way. And I love to just answer them anonymously here on the podcast. And today I'm kind of going to break it up into 2 parts. So I'm going to answer 3 main questions that I got today, and then we'll do part 2 about kids and sweets next week. But in the meantime, if you have additional questions or follow-up questions that you would like me to answer, you can always send them my way anytime to hello@crystalcargis.com or come connect with me on Instagram. And I would love to hear what questions you're thinking about and use this space as a place where we can help create more clarity and confidence for you. And so let's dive in. I got 3 great questions around kids and sweets that we're going to cover today. And the first one here is very relatable. And this question reads, I want to take steps to normalize sweets in our home, but I'm seriously worried about the effect of sugar on my kids' teeth. Won't this make them more prone to cavities? This is such a great question. And I know something that as a parent that cares for your child, this is a concern that can come up, right? If we're taking steps to normalize sweets and providing them and offering them more frequently, will that make your child more susceptible to cavities? I think part of this too is that we receive a lot of messages from well-meaning professionals. So you may take your child in to their dentist checkups and you might hear certain things from your dentist or, get pamphlets or information around what your child should or shouldn't eat. And that can add to the confusion. And I think that can make it really difficult to feel comfortable in normalizing sweets intentionally in your home. So I want to take some time to answer this as well as give you some tips. And first thing to understand is that cavities or tooth decay are actually not directly caused by exposure to sugar from food alone. So cavities can form when the tooth enamel is exposed to acid, which is actually formed by bacteria in the mouth. So plaque, which is a sticky film of bacteria that can essentially cover the teeth, turns sugar from food and drinks that are ingested into acid. So it's actually the acid in the mouth that can break down tooth enamel and form a cavity. And that cavity can continue to spread deeper through the layers of the tooth once it forms. But again, what's important to understand is that it's not sugar alone that actually creates tooth enamel decay. So it's the combination of plaque or bacteria in the mouth and sugar from food and beverages that have been ingested that creates the acid in the mouth, which then can cause cavities on the tooth. So this is an important distinction to make because again, sometimes we're under the assumption that it's sugar alone that's a risk factor for tooth decay. But what I want you to see here is that nearly everything that we're consuming provides some sort of nourishment to the bacteria in our mouth, which can then be used to produce acid that attacks our teeth. But again, what we want to understand is that all carbohydrate-based foods, so not just sweets, things like candy or cupcakes or cookies, really it's all carbohydrate-based foods, including things like fruits and grains and dairy, even vegetables, which are carbohydrates. They actually begin breaking down into the simplest usable form of energy in the mouth. And so digestion is actually beginning in the mouth with salivary amylase. That's a fancy word. It's an enzyme basically, which starts to begin the process of breaking down sugar from any carbohydrate sources that have been ingested. So it's really, again, important to understand this point because we tend to kind of lump in sweets into their own separate category and treat them differently. But when we're talking about digestion, sweets are being broken down into the simplest units of energy, which is glucose, in the same way that other carbohydrate-rich foods, including things like grains and pasta, bread, again, dairy, fruits, veggies, like the same way that those carbohydrate foods are being broken down is the same way that sweets are being broken down. And again, it's not sugar alone, which is the culprit for causing tooth decay. And, we tend to have this perception that if we eliminate sugar or things like candy or cookies, cupcakes, things that our kids may really be interested in, if we eliminate that, then that will somehow solve the problem. But, essentially we're still eating carbohydrate-based foods, or at least we should be, right? Because carbohydrates are our body's preferred source of fuel. They are a main macronutrient that our bodies need. So, again, if we're saying sugar is causing tooth decay and we want to eliminate sweets, then, we have to carry that same reason to any source of carbohydrate that is going to break down into glucose, which is all of our carbohydrates. And, it's not conducive to good health to eliminate carbohydrates from our diet. And of course, we want to remember that sweets are a form of carbohydrate. They are a form of macronutrients to the body that we can utilize for energy, us and our children. And so again, we don't want to think about eliminating sweets as somehow solving a problem to reducing tooth decay in the mouth, because any carbohydrate source of food is going to start breaking down in the mouth. And again, that can be a form of nourishment for bacteria that's already in the mouth that creates the acid that now can expose the tooth to decay. I know that may seem like a simplistic explanation, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but I just want to again, paint the big picture that it's not sweets alone that is creating a breakdown of glucose in the mouth, that there's other things and other foods that we're ingesting that are also going through the same digestive process. And saying that somehow eliminating those foods is going to solve the problem is really not a practical way to approach this. And again, it's important to understand that there are multiple things that can increase your child's risk of cavities, not just eating sweets alone. And that tends to be the common culprit that is described to us. But in reality, there's a lot of various factors that can increase the risk of cavities. And I'll go through a few of those today. But one is just oral hygiene in general, right? Like not taking proper care of our teeth, including brushing and flossing. That can be a risk factor for tooth decay because it can increase the levels of plaque or bacteria in the mouth. And again, plaque plus sugar in the mouth can create acid, which then creates more exposure and risk for tooth decay. And so oral hygiene is a big part of that. And this can be really tough for a lot of kids, especially children who may have oral sensitivities or who may struggle with having things in their mouth. That can be hard. And I know for me, I experienced various levels of this with all my kids, but sometimes feeling like we can help our kids brush their teeth can feel like such an uphill battle. So irregular oral hygiene can definitely be an increased risk factor, as is having inadequate dental care, which for a lot of families is a real struggle. So these are things alone that can increase risk of dental cavities. Other things that we may not think of, one being here is having a dry mouth or lower saliva levels. So saliva is actually really important for neutralizing the acids in the mouth created by bacteria and sugar. And some kids tend to have drier mouths for different reasons, and that can essentially be a higher risk factor for cavities. So sometimes having drier mouth can be associated with certain illnesses or autoimmune conditions, or it can be related to impaired or injured salivary glands, as well as stress or dehydration can also contribute to a drier mouth. And again, just like some kids struggle with oral hygiene and brushing their teeth, other kids may really struggle with drinking their fluids or getting enough water during the day. And again, those things can contribute to a higher risk for cavities. Another thing here is just having weaker tooth enamel. Some children just naturally have weaker tooth enamel, or the anatomy of their tooth structure is different, and that can be influenced by genetics or family history, also different childhood illnesses. And there is some research that supports that certain nutrient deficiencies, like a vitamin D deficiency, can contribute to weak or brittle teeth. And again, having weaker tooth enamel can make your child more susceptible to tooth decay. Along with this is just the anatomy of the mouth and teeth anatomy in general. So some children who have teeth that are more crowded together or teeth that are very close together can be more susceptible to cavities just because of the potential for different pockets of where plaque can form and cavity causing bacteria can accumulate. And it can also be harder to thoroughly clean those areas in the mouth where the teeth are very close together. I know I have a couple kiddos that just naturally, like their mouth anatomy, their teeth are very close. And sometimes it's hard to even floss it because they're so kind of tight together. And so that can be a risk factor that makes them more prone to cavities as well. Other things here are oral microbiome. So that refers to the bacteria that live in our mouth. We all have different bacteria that live in our mouths. And, some research has suggested that we have up to 700 different species of bacteria in our mouth. Whoa. Wild, right? But many of them are working essentially synergistically to help keep our mouths healthy. There are certain environmental factors that can disrupt our kind of baseline oral microbiome. And those can include things like medications, antibiotics, and sometimes just that disruption in the microbiome can make a child more susceptible to tooth decay, including our kids. And so as you can see, it's not just about the food. There's so many various factors that can include our risk of tooth decay, and especially in our kids. And so it's really important, again, to keep that big picture in mind so that we're not demonizing sweets as the problem. Because when we are thinking about it in that lens, it becomes really easy to approach sweets from a more restrictive mindset. And when we are more prone to restricting our child's access to sweets, it only elevates those foods on a pedestal for them. And it's important to remember that when sweets feel restricted to a child, or when access feels limited, they are more likely to binge on those foods or overeat them when access is made available. And so erratic eating behaviors, which again can be caused by restricted access to sweets, are actually more damaging to our teeth than having regular exposure to sweets in the context of meals and snacks. So I hope that helps just, again, paint the bigger picture for you and take away some of that fear that can rise up when it comes to exposing your child to sweets, because I get it. And as a mom, I definitely understand. And I know all those messages that are out there. I hear it from my dentist all the time saying things like, well, don't let them eat this or don't let them eat that. And it's hard to not internalize those messages and try to navigate a different approach when we are feeling fearful around our child's having or eating some of these foods, because cavities are not fun and dental work is not cheap. And so, of course, you want to do everything possible to help support your child in not just having a healthy relationship with food, but also having healthy teeth too. So while we're on this question, I want to give you 3 tips here to keep in mind when it comes to a healthy relationship with sweets, plus keeping your child's teeth healthy. So tip number 1 is just aim to really make sweets part of meal times. And there are many benefits of this. And one is actually serving as a protective factor for your child's teeth. And, the other big one here is that it really does help kids build a positive relationship with all foods, and it takes sweets off the pedestal. But essentially, when we are eating in a way that combines different macronutrients, including fats and proteins, alongside carbohydrates, that can actually help protect teeth enamel from the acid in the mouth. And so that is another really great benefit of just making sweets or dessert, whatever it is in your home, alongside the other foods that your child is used to seeing. The key here, though, is to not pressure them to eat certain foods. So you might offer dessert with your dinner and your child just goes for the dessert and doesn't want to eat anything else. That's okay. It's important to stay consistent and really trust that over time, your child will naturally kind of gravitate towards learning how to eat different foods. But we don't want to pressure our kids, because that can essentially backfire and be counterintuitive, but continue to be consistent in exposing and offering sweets alongside other foods that they're used to eating. Tip number 2 here is just to maintain somewhat of a flexible meal rhythm in your home. And the reason for that is that when kids are just grazing throughout the day, that can sometimes create more problematic issues when it comes to increasing the time that their teeth are potentially exposed to acid in the mouth, which again can elevate their risk for dental caries or cavities. So sticking to a meal routine can be helpful with decreasing grazing and thereby decreasing their risk of cavities. But this doesn't mean that this has to be rigid. I've seen a lot of things out there promoting this idea of a really strict meal schedule, and that's definitely not what I'm promoting here. But again, just like a natural rhythm around meals and snacks that creates predictability around eating in your home, and that should ideally fit in with your family's rhythms. And so working towards that can help decrease the grazing, which again can help decrease your child's risk of cavities. Third tip here, which I know may seem obvious, but again, a mom myself having kids that have struggled with brushing their teeth, we want to think about modeling caring for our own teeth. And we don't want to underestimate the importance of modeling and how this can really support our kids in naturally building curiosity and desire to take care of their own teeth. And we want it to be something that becomes internalized and something that they want to do from their own intrinsic motivation, right? Not because we're telling them like, you need to brush your teeth or you're going to get cavities, but we want to model the behavior so that they naturally learn how to do that for themselves and want to do that for themselves. And so, man, I feel like I've had to try so many different things and so many different tricks in the book. And really, I just found by making my kids part of the process, like, hey, come and watch mommy brush your teeth. It's not even like really forcing them to do it, but just inviting them to be part of the process, or doing a silly dance while I'm brushing my teeth and kind of entertaining my kids. I wish I had a video to show you some of the things that I've done to actually model this behavior for them, but it can be hard. And I think when we can make it fun and make it inviting for our kids, then they're naturally going to be more curious and excited to get on board with that, right? Versus it feeling like another chore that they have to do. And so don't underestimate the power of modeling, and remember that our kids are constantly watching what we're doing. And if they see you regularly brushing, they are more likely to want to do it too. So making it a fun part of your daily routine and giving yourself grace through the process, because, it can feel like just another thing to do. But, knowing that some kids just need more support and a positive approach and gentle approach to integrating these behaviors. And again, last thing I just want to remind you is just keeping the big picture in mind and remembering that restricting sweets is not going to be a long-term solution. And sometimes we are going to get that pushback from our providers when we take our kids to the dentist. And I am going to link a blog post on this subject for you in the show notes. But one thing that I started doing with our dentist is actually writing a little script that I would take and either pass to the assistant to pass to the dentist, or, write a little note in their chart and send it off to the dentist before the dentist actually comes and sees our child. But, just communicating to them that, look, I am concerned about my kids' teeth, but I also am concerned about their relationship with food. And I would appreciate you talking to my child about healthy habits that they can integrate about their teeth that don't have anything to do with restricting food or sweets. Because again, that can be really problematic or just create seeds in our kids' brain that start to cause them to fear certain foods. And we want to shield them from that as much as possible. And so I'll link that in the show notes for you in case you're interested in having that script that you can use with your dentist as well. So I hope that helps answer your question. And thank you so much again, Mama, for sharing that question. It's a really great topic, and I hope that gives you some tips to help you work through that. So next question here is, what age should I introduce sweets to my child? I've heard of the no sugar before 2 recommendations. Is it harmful if I introduce sweets too early? Such a great question. I remember being really confused about this as well with my oldest when she was a baby, because I heard the same things from our pediatrician, like no sweets before 2, no sugar before 2, as though their bodies can't handle it or process it, which is not true. And, what's interesting is the difference between my oldest, who is now 12, and my youngest, who is 5. And, with my oldest, we didn't necessarily intentionally integrate different sweets in her kind of meals and snacks until she started getting a little bit older and started getting more exposure to them. So I remember the first time we took her to a birthday party and, she was aware and of the different things that were there and the sweets and the cake and all of that. And so once she started showing interest in those things, I definitely was like, okay, I need to start integrating this more. But, oftentimes kids are just not aware of the different things that are out there when they're younger. And so it's important to remember that sweets can come in a variety of different forms, including fruit and yogurt and baked goods. And, it's not necessarily just candy and cookies and things like that. But, there's a variety of different ways in which we can integrate sweets for our kids. And I think what's important is that, number one, it's things that are naturally being integrated into your home as it is. And rather than looking at the age of your child, I think it's more important to understand when is your child having more awareness about these different foods and showing interest in them. When our kids start showing interest in various foods, whether it's sweets or packaged snacks or different things like that, we now want to be intentional about incorporating those things. So it's funny, just for comparison, my youngest, who, like I mentioned, is 5 now, and when she was a baby, she was getting exposure to many different sweets at a much younger age than any of my other children, because she was the youngest of 5 kids. She is the youngest of 5 kids. And so as a baby, she was watching her siblings eating ice cream and cookies and even candy, right? And so she was naturally interested in those things because she was seeing them. She was getting exposure to them. And so I would give her sweets at a young age and well before 2, And what's amazing is that I would say, all my kids have a really great relationship with food, but my youngest is so tuned in to her body's cues and really does an amazing job self-regulating sweets. But I honestly think a big part of that is because she had exposure at such a young age. And I realize that may feel counterintuitive, but again, just remembering that all foods are contributing some source of nutrition to our children. And it's not so much about the age. We don't want to use age necessarily as a marker of when to introduce these things, but more so looking at our child and being responsive to what our child needs. Are they showing an interest in different foods because they're starting to get exposure to them? And if so, we want to be intentional about now incorporating those things and making them available to them so that it doesn't become something that feels inaccessible or, that they put up on a pedestal. And I do have one slight caveat here, and that is to just be cognizant of any hidden agendas that you may have. So, for example, I know and have worked with many different moms who may not bring certain sweets into their home because it's a food that they're not yet comfortable. And by default, their child is not getting exposure to those foods until much older. But then when that child starts, going to birthday parties or to school and seeing different friends bring different foods, it can start to become more problematic. So it's always important to just be aware of your own hidden agenda and your own relationship with food, and seeing how is your relationship with food potentially impacting the way that you're feeding your child or the foods that you're choosing to bring in your home. Are there any kind of ingrained food rules that are limiting the foods that you are willingly exposing your child to? And again, because sweets can feel so problematic sometimes, or, just based on your own history or relationship with food, you might not feel comfortable having those things in the home, and you might not feel comfortable having your kids eat them as well. And so it's important to ask yourself, what is preventing you from offering those things? And remembering that we can trust our kids. We can trust them to regulate all foods, including sweets. And I find that the younger kids are, the more connected they really are to their intuitive eating cues. And having different experiences only helps them kind of better refine their intuitive eating abilities. So if your child is getting exposure to sweets before age 2, don't stress and trust the process. The only thing I do caution of, and I've learned this with my own children, is two things. So we don't want to introduce honey to children who are 1 age or younger because of the potential food safety risk with that. Over 1 year of age, honey is fine. So if honey is baked into, baked products or different things like that, after 1, totally okay. Before 1, we want to be careful and avoid it just for the food safety risk. The other thing is just being careful with any foods or sweets that may be a choking hazard. And this is something that I remember going through a lot, where my older kids would have candy, and my daughter, who was a baby at the time, would find them and try to put them in her mouth. And that was hard because, she couldn't necessarily have those things, not because the food itself, but because it could be a choking hazard to a child who's younger, especially 4 years and younger. So as much as possible, trying to find alternatives or different things that your child can have that are not potentially a choking hazard can always be helpful in terms of just keeping them safe. But I hope this helps. I know there's a lot of confusion around this topic, and if there's anything further that I can help clarify for you, Mama, let me know. So that brings us to our third question for today. And like I said, we'll have part 2 on this tomorrow. So to this last question here is, how often should I be offering my kids sweets? We're starting incorporating them more regularly, but my kids still seem obsessive with them. And this is a great question, and I wish I could ask some follow-up questions to this just to kind of better understand the situation here. And I will say generally, though, if you have maybe limited the amount of sweets that your kids do have access to, and you're starting to normalize them and bring them in your home and incorporate them with meals and snacks, just know that you're in this for the long haul, okay? That this is a marathon, this is not a sprint. And I think having that perspective is really important, because sometimes we just expect like, oh, I have sweets in the home, like they should chill, like they should be fine now. But, if kids have not had regular access to sweets previously, it's going to take some time and some consistency for them to actually trust that these foods are a regular part of their everyday. And, that's why I say it's really important to be consistent and to be patient with the process. And it's not abnormal to see kids, often like become all about the sweets when sweets are first being introduced or, normalized in your home. And what I tend to see is, let's say you're starting to introduce sweets and you're including them with meals versus reserving them for after meal times. And, what tends to happen is that kids primarily will only be interested in the dessert for a long time. At least that's my own anecdotal experience that I've seen, where you're offering, and let's say your kid used to eat, different foods that you would offer for dinner, but now that you're providing the sweet with your meal, they're no longer interested in eating those foods and just want to eat the dessert and not really interested in trying other things. That is completely normal and expected. And in fact, it may take some time and again, consistency for your child to then feel comfortable to naturally get curious about moving on to other foods. And really, they're able to do that when they can trust, oh, sweets are here every day. And so, I know that I get to have all these different things. And that alone can just alleviate some of that anxiety about not having access to sweets, which again opens them up to have some natural curiosity in exploring other foods. It's really cool to watch, and it does take time though, and it does take consistency. With that said though, I will say that in general, and again, this is my own anecdotal evidence, but we tend to underestimate how frequent our kids need exposure to sweets, or the quantity of sweets that our kids actually need to feel satiated. And so it's really easy to default to an amount that maybe feels more comfortable for you. So for example, if sweets have been kind of limited in your home and you're bringing them into your home, it may feel uncomfortable, right? Like it can bring up a lot for you, especially if you're navigating this for the first time, or you're also navigating your own relationship with food and sweets. And so sometimes I see parents bringing sweets in the home, but then also creating different rules around that. So we're only going to have sweets once a day. I'm just giving some examples here. Or, one time a day or with one certain meal. And that can start to become problematic. And again, I wish I could just give you a simple formula, but the reality is that all kids need something different, really. And all children are going to need different levels of exposure to sweets depending on various different things, depending on temperament and, access to sweets and food. And there's so many different variables here. So it's really not easy to just give one concrete explanation in terms of how frequently you should be offering it. But what I will say is that it likely will need to be more frequently than what you're comfortable with. And I know that can be hard to navigate because we want to stay within our boundaries of what feels comfortable to us. But again, it may not be quite enough to help your kids move through this process. And I typically recommend offering sweets multiple times a day just as a baseline. I think for many kids, that is the level of frequency that they need to see it in order to relax around it and to not feel obsessive or preoccupied with it. With that being said, though, I know that this can be really challenging, and sweets is one of those hard things to navigate, especially if you are feeling a lot of distress coming up for you. And so I just want to throw it out there that if you are feeling like you need a lot more hand-holding through this process to help resolve a sweets obsession in one of your kiddos at home, please reach out to me and let me know. I would love to help support you with this. But in general, again, sometimes our kids need a frequency of sweets that's higher than what we are defaulting to, because our default tends to be an underestimation of what our kids need. So I just want to give you the biggest hug, Mama, and say kudos for taking this brave step to incorporate sweets more regularly. And I just want to encourage you to trust the process and know like you're taking such a brave step to really help your kids build a positive relationship with sweets, and to know that it's going to take time. It does take consistency. And also, I just want to encourage you, or even challenge you, giving you some gentle encouragement and some tough love here, to know that sometimes we need to move outside of what feels comfortable for us in order to be responsive to what our kids need. And that often means offering sweets more frequently, or just experimenting with maybe offering it at different times, offering it before your child has to ask you, surprising them with, a different sweet that you are just bringing in the home without them having to ask or beg or plead with you, right? So it's really learning to be responsive to what our kids need. And one final tip here that I will kind of wrap up with is knowing that especially when sweets exposure is higher, so candy-centered holidays, birthday parties, things like that, when candy exposure or sweets exposure is higher because of what's happening in our child's environment, that is usually indicative of our kids needing more exposure and more permission and more access. And what I tend to see is the opposite. So like, if a child is getting more exposure, more access to sweets, we tend to want to rein it in and limit or tightly control how much they're getting. But it's really the opposite. Like our kids need to have more access and permission when they are getting more exposure. And so that's something to keep in mind, especially with many different candy-centered holidays kind of on the horizon, past and present. Like there's always a candy-centered holiday coming up. And if not, your kid's probably going to a birthday party and getting a ton of candy. And so you want to be able to give permission and to integrate that frequently within the context of their meals and snacks. And again, I just want to clarify that doesn't mean just giving them free reign all day long, just letting them eat whatever they want all day long. It's really important to integrate it within your meal routine. So I hope that helps, Mama. I so appreciate this question, and it really shows your willingness to explore this further in order to, again, help your kids have a positive and trusting relationship with food, which is amazing. I love it. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you can come back next week for part 2, where we'll be delving into more questions from you around kids and sweets. And again, if you have some follow-up questions or questions that you would like to add, please don't hesitate to reach out. I always love hearing from you, and let me know what you think about this format of the podcast of just answering different questions on a certain topic. I hope it's helpful, and just knowing that your question is likely something that another parent and mom is thinking of as well. So it's always encouraging when we can bring the community together in this way. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I cannot wait to see you again next week. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Lift the Shame podcast. For more tips and guidance on your motherhood journey, come connect with me on Instagram at Crystal Cargis. Until next week, Mama, I'll be cheering you on. Bye for now.